Thanks for joining us tonight. We'd love to know where you're listening from and who you're sharing this moment with. Drop a comment below. My name is John. If you saw me today, you'd see a man beaten down by life. Not always, though. I used to have dreams, ambitions, thought I'd make something of myself. But life doesn't care about that. One bad choice snowballs, and before you know it, you're sitting outside a casino, your pockets empty, wondering how the hell it all fell apart. I was that guy. Lost everything. Casino, lottery tickets, stupid bets. I'd thought I was one step away from the big break. Turns out, I was just digging my own grave. I wasn't always like this, but once you're broke, reality sinks in fast. My friends bailed, the rent was overdue, and the only thing I had left was my beat-up car. It wasn't much, but it was mine. I was desperate, scrambling for ideas, when a buddy of mine suggested I drive for Uber. At first, I laughed. Me, driving strangers around all day? But then, I thought, why not? It wasn't like I had options. I wasn't greedy, just desperate. So, that's what I did. I signed up, got approved, and before I knew it, I was picking people up, taking them to their destination, making just enough to scrape by. It wasn't a solution, but it kept me afloat. Barely. But God, I was tired. I needed something bigger, something that would pull me out of this hole. That's when she got into my car. It was late, past midnight, just another slow night. I was sitting in the driver's seat, thinking about how I was going to pay the bills that month when she appeared out of nowhere. She was standing on the curb looking at me through the window, like she'd been waiting for me specifically. I rolled the window down, and she smiled. Not a regular smile. There was something about it that made me feel like she knew more than she let on. Her clothes were strange too, like she was stuck in the 80s or something. Old-fashioned, but elegant. It was odd, yet there was something magnetic about her. She had this presence, like she was from another world. "I need a ride," she said, calm. "Where to?" I asked, my hand hovering over the app. "Denali National Park," she replied, almost like it was no big deal. I stared at her. "Alaska? That's hours away. You know how far that is?" She didn't blink. "I'll pay you 10 times the original price." That made me pause. 10 times? My mind was racing. I wasn't greedy, but I was struggling. That kind of money could help me out big time. Pay off the debt, maybe even get me back on my feet. She got in this back, sliding gracefully into the seat, and as soon as I started driving, I felt this weird tension in the air. The night seemed darker than usual, the road quieter. No traffic, no noise. Just me and her. "Why Denali?" I asked after a few minutes of silence. "I've been there for a long time," she said, almost too casually. "About 300 years, give or take." I almost laughed, but something about her tone made me glance in the rearview mirror. She wasn't smiling, not even looking at me. Her eyes were fixed on the road ahead, as if she'd already been there and was just waiting to return. I chuckled nervously. 300 years, huh? She laughed softly, but it didn't sound like a joke. My skin crawled, and I quickly turned my eyes back to the road. The miles rolled on, the clock ticking past 2 a.m. when things took a turn for the worse. We were in the middle of nowhere, just an empty highway flanked by trees when I saw someone standing in the road ahead. A woman, her arm raised, asking for a lift. At first, I slowed down, but as I got closer, something felt wrong. My headlights swept over her, and I saw her legs. They were twisted. Both of them, bent in opposite directions, like something out of a nightmare. My foot slammed on the gas. I sped past her without looking back. Victoria, the woman in the back, leaned forward, her voice calm. "Why didn't you stop?" I swallowed hard, gripping the wheel. "Didn't you see her legs?" They were twisted, like something was wrong with her. Like a witch or something. Victoria laughed, and it sent a chill down my spine. "Oh, John," she said, her voice suddenly dripping with something dark. "Didn't you see? My legs?" My heart nearly stopped. I didn't want to look. I didn't. But something made me glance into the mirror again. And there, in the dim light, I saw her legs. They weren't human. They were black, skinny, and twisted in ways no legs should be. Just like the woman on the road. My blood ran cold as I realized the truth. She leaned forward, her voice low, almost a whisper. "You should have stopped, John. Now, you're mine." Before I could react, she lunged at me, her body contorting in ways that defied reason. Her hands, if you could call them that, gripped the back of my seat as she pulled herself toward me. Her face, God, I can't even describe it. It wasn't human anymore. Her eyes were glowing red, her mouth stretching impossibly wide as a demonic laugh filled the car. I screamed, swerving the car violently, trying to shake her off, but it was no use. She was on me, her cold breath on my neck, her fingers, long, bony claws now, digging into my shoulders. The last thing I remember before everything went black was the sound of her laugh. That horrible, inhuman laugh. When I woke up, the car was empty. I was parked on the side of the road, alone, the faint glow of dawn breaking in the distance. My body ached, my mind racing as I tried to make sense of what had happened. But then I noticed something that made my blood freeze. My wallet was gone, my phone too. And in the seat where Victoria had sat, there was a note. Just 4 words, scrawled in red ink. "See you next time. I don't drive Uber anymore. In fact, I don't drive at all." That night, it changed me. I still hear her laugh sometimes, in the quiet of the night, echoing in the back of my mind. I don't know what she was, but I know this. She's still out there. And she's waiting. "Let me take you back, far before you were born," I said to my granddaughter, Leah, easing myself gently in my old chair as Leah's eyes went wide with curiosity. Boston had a way of eating people alive back then, though nobody really spoke about it. Every 37 years, like clockwork, something terrible would happen. People went insane. Ordinary, good people. Neighbors, friends, family members, they'd turn. They'd start acting strange. First, it would be little things. You'd catch them staring off into space or muttering under their breath. But then it got worse. Much worse. I could feel the memory scratching at the back of my mind. The way people's eyes would glaze over. That vacant expression they took on before they did. Things no decent human being should ever do. Leah didn't need to hear that part just yet. They'd kill people, Leah. Not just harm them, they'd kill. I'm talking about husbands killing their wives, mothers killing their babies. And afterwards they'd act like it never happened, like they'd been some kind of trance. Some didn't even remember it at all. When the madness finally lifted after a few months, the survivors returned to their homes, as if nothing had happened. But something did. Oh, it did. Leah's face paled a little, but she did not say anything. I knew her brain was working it over, trying to make sense of it. But this story? There was no sense to be made. Now, here's where it gets dark, I said, my voice dropping somewhat. The city wasn't just cursed, no. It was controlled. You have heard of the devil, right? All right. Well, Boston wasn't the devil's playground, but it was his experiment. And his right-hand man, Robert, he ran the whole show. I could see the look of "this is unbelievable" on Leah's face. I don't blame her. These are things you would listen to when watching a bad movie. But I continued. Robert wasn't like us. No, he was different. He looked human enough. Tall, handsome, dressed like he had money. He had that way about him, like people couldn't help but trust him. But he wasn't one of us. Robert was a servant of the devil himself. He had the power to control minds, Leah. He could make people do things they didn't want to do, things they didn't even realize they were doing. He was behind all that madness in Boston. Every 37 years, he'd whisper to people's minds, make them snap, make them hurt those they loved. And it was all part of the devil's plan. Leah's jaw dropped slightly, and I wished she would have left it alone for just that instant. But no matter, I talked on. I had to get through this part. I had to make her understand. Now, Robert, he had a wife. Anna, sweet woman, didn't know the first thing about what her husband was really like. She thought she married a good man, someone that would take care of her, and she hadn't known the truth. Not initially, at least. I hesitated, the weight of what was to come heavy inside. I hadn't spoken of Anna in years, not to a soul. But Leah deserved to know. This needed to be said. Anna got pregnant, I said, my tone quieter now. But it wasn't a normal pregnancy. Something had gone wrong right from the outset. She could feel it, deep inside her. She'd go to the doctor, and every time he'd say the same thing. You're pregnant, Anna, but there's no baby. They couldn't see anything on the scans. No fetus, nothing. Yet her body showed all the signs. She was growing. She could feel something moving inside her. And it wasn't human. Leah squirmed uncomfortably in her chair, her eyes darting down to her lap for a second before meeting mine again. I could see the questions beginning to whirl around in her brain, but I wasn't finished. Robert knew what it was. He knew exactly what was happening, and he was thrilled. You see, Anna was carrying the devil's child, and Robert, he was preparing for its birth. He'd do anything to make sure that baby was born. Anyone who got in his way, well, they didn't last long. People started disappearing, quietly. No one questioned it. At least, not for long. I had inhaled deeply, steadying myself before continuing. This next part always sends cold chills down my spine. When the baby was finally born, they named him Ben. He looked normal, like any other newborn. Cried, cooed, even smiled as he grew up. For years, you wouldn't have known he was any different. But Robert knew. He was waiting. And when the time was right, when Ben was old enough to understand, Robert started to teach him. Slowly, carefully, he planted the seeds of who Ben really was. The son of the devil, the child of darkness. Leah's breath hitched, but she said nothing. Her knuckles had turned white, clenching onto the edge of the chair. Ben was a good boy, though. He really was. For the longest time, he didn't show any signs of being what he was. But you can't keep something like that buried forever. As he grew older, it started to show. His power, the darkness inside him. And Robert? He encouraged it. He nurtured it, Leah. He wanted Ben to become what he was meant to be. I stopped, my throat tight. This was the part that always got me. And then, one night, it happened. Ben, he became what Robert had been waiting for. He transformed, Leah. I don't know how else to explain it. One moment, he was a normal boy, and the next, he wasn't. He was the devil's son. And the first thing he did, he killed Robert, his own father. Leah's eyes were wide, her mouth partially open, but nothing came out. I knew she was trying to process it all, trying to make sense of the madness I was laying out in front of her. After that, Anna finally realized what had happened, what her husband had done, what her son had become. And she, well, she couldn't take it. She loved Ben, but she knew what he was. She knew he couldn't stay. So she did the only thing she could think of. She called a team. People who knew how to deal with this sort of thing. Exorcists. They came and they did what needed to be done. They banished the devil from Ben. And with that, the madness in Boston lifted. I felt a tear start to rise, but I blinked it away. I needed to finish this. But Ben, he didn't survive. The boy Anna had loved, the son she had raised, he was gone. And the city? The city was free. Free from the madness that had taken hold of it for so many years. But it cost Anna everything. Leah didn't say anything. Her eyes just welled up and her hands, still balled up into tight fists, sat in her lap. She just looked at me and waited. Maybe for me to explain how I knew any of this. Maybe for me to tell her that it wasn't true, that it was just a story. But I couldn't do that. This was the truth. And that's it, I said, my voice little above a whisper. That's the story of how Boston was freed. How a mother had to sacrifice her own son to save the city. To save everyone. Leah sat there, frozen, her face pale, her eyes wide. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, she spoke. "Grandma, how do you know all of this?" I looked at her, my heart heavy, and for the first time in years said the truth. "Because, Leah," I said in a whisper, "I was Anna." I used to do contract fieldwork assignments that took me all over the U.S. It was a good gig, but the pay wasn't great, so I tried to save every penny I could. Instead of splurging on motels or rental cabins, I'd camp out in the back of my truck. I'd built a decent setup with a camper shell that was all decked out on the inside. It wasn't fancy, but it was comfortable and private. Just me, my truck, and the open road. I liked it that way. Most of the time, things went off without a hitch. I'd find a quiet spot, park, cook myself some dinner, and then fall asleep to the sounds of nature. No big deal. No problems. At least, that's how it went until I found myself in Texas. I'd been driving for hours that day, just trying to cover as much ground as possible. It was getting late, and I needed a place to crash for the night. That's when I stumbled upon this little lake, out in the middle of nowhere. There was only one road in and out, and as far as I could tell, I was the only person around. It seemed perfect, secluded, peaceful, no one to bother me. I thought I'd hit the jackpot. I parked my truck by the water, took a deep breath of that cool evening air, and just relaxed for a moment. It felt good to be off the road. I set up camp, cooked myself a quick meal, and then crawled into the back of the truck to sleep. The shell didn't have any windows, which I liked for the privacy, but I guess it also made the truck look like it could be hiding something valuable. I didn't think about that at the time, though. I was just glad to be alone. I must have been dead asleep when it happened. Around 3:30 in the morning, I woke up to the sound of movement outside. At first, I wasn't sure what it was. Maybe an animal? But no, it was too deliberate for that. I froze, trying to listen. Then I heard the unmistakable sound of hands messing with the locks on my truck. My heart jumped into my throat. Someone was trying to break in. I carefully peered out from a tiny crack between the camper shell and the bed of the truck. That's when I saw them. A group of people, maybe 8 or 10, creeping around in the darkness. They were twitchy, jittery, like they were high on something. My brain went into overdrive. These weren't just random campers. These were tweakers, and they were after something in my truck. Panic surged through me, but I knew I had to stay calm. I couldn't just sit there and wait for them to break in. I had to get out, but there was no way I could confront that many people, especially when they were high and unpredictable. I quietly grabbed my knife, slipped my keys into my pocket, and eased myself out of the truck. I moved as silently as I could. Slipping into the shadows of some nearby bushes, I crouched there, barely breathing, praying they hadn't noticed me. From my hiding spot, I could see them more clearly now. They weren't just poking around, they were serious. 2 of them had guns, and they were blocking the only road out with their vehicles. I was trapped, and they were armed. My mind was racing, trying to figure out what to do. I couldn't just stay hidden forever, but making a run for it seemed impossible. I was outnumbered, outgunned, and completely cornered. I had one idea. I still had my keys, and I knew the truck alarm might scare them off, or at least confuse them. I carefully reached into my pocket, fingers trembling, and hit the panic button. The alarm blared to life, lights flashing, and for a moment, everything was chaos. The tweakers jumped back, startled, and I used the moment to get a better look at them. There were more of them than I'd thought, at least 10, maybe more, but they didn't run. They just stood there, blinking in the lights, looking confused and angry. Then, just as suddenly, they started to calm down. One of them, the biggest guy in the group, waved at the others, and they slowly backed off. But they didn't leave. Instead, they started a fire a little ways off, near the edge of the lake. I watched as they huddled around it, doing more drugs, talking in low, slurred voices. Every now and then, one of them would wander off into the darkness, staggering around like a zombie, only to come back a few minutes later. It was like something out of a nightmare. I stayed hidden behind those bushes for hours, watching them, waiting. They'd occasionally shoot their guns into the air, whooping and yelling nonsense. The sound echoed across the lake, and every time it did, my heart jumped. I was scared out of my mind, but I couldn't let it show. I couldn't move, couldn't make a sound. All I could do was wait and hope they didn't find me. Eventually, after what felt like an eternity, they started to crash. One by one, they passed out around the fire, slumping over in their chairs or just collapsing on the ground. It was the break I'd been waiting for. I moved as quietly as I could, slipping back to my truck. My hands were shaking as I got in, but I knew I couldn't afford to mess this up. I had to get out of there. The road was still blocked, but I wasn't about to sit around and wait for them to wake up. I revved the engine, gunned it, and plowed through the brush. Branches scraped against the sides of the truck as I tore my way around their vehicles, but I didn't care. I just needed to get away. When I finally hit the main road, I didn't stop driving until I reached the nearest town. I found a cheap hotel, but sleep didn't come easy that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw them, those hollow-eyed tweakers, staggering through the darkness, firing their guns into the sky. Even now, I can't shake the feeling of how close I came to being stuck out there, with no way out. It was the one time on the road that I really felt fear, and it's stayed with me ever since. My girlfriend and I planned a special trip. It was her birthday and our anniversary. We decided to go camping 5 hours away from home. The day after a big storm had passed through, we left early. We thought the timing was perfect. When we arrived at the campsite, the guy at the entrance told us that no one else was there. He said we had the entire place to ourselves. We were thrilled. "This is going to be amazing," we said. We drove down long, winding paths to our spot. The road got narrower the closer we got. It was so tight, we'd have to back out to leave. We unloaded our stuff, set up the tent, and decided to explore the woods. The forest was eerily quiet. It was still bright, but something about it felt off. We walked a few miles until we came across some strange white cabins. They were all identical, set way off the main path. There was no one around, no signs of life. It felt wrong, like we weren't supposed to be there. We turned around and went back to the tent. Back at camp, we struggled to start a fire. Neither of us had ever been camping before. We bought self-lighting logs and lighter fluid, but everything was wet from the rain. We couldn't find any dry kindling. We eventually got a small fire going, cooked hot dogs and marshmallows, and tried to enjoy the stars. As darkness fell, it became unsettlingly quiet. My girlfriend was getting nervous. "Can we go into the tent?" she asked. We put out the fire and crawled inside. We were talking, trying to relax, when she suddenly put her hand over my mouth. "Shh, do you hear that?" she whispered. I listened. There were footsteps, heavy and deliberate. It sounded like a group of people walking. I tried to reassure her, "It's probably just animals." But then we heard mumbling. Not animal noises, These were muffled words like someone was whispering just outside our tent. We sat in the dark, staring at each other, frozen. The mumbling grew louder, the footsteps closer. It felt like they were right outside. We were paralyzed with fear, barely breathing. Then, it went silent. We waited, unsure how long. My girlfriend finally broke the silence. "We need to get to your car." My heart was racing. I peered out of the tent into the darkness. "Stay behind me," I told her. We bolted for the car, my mind racing. I locked the doors and she started panicking. "What was that? We can't stay here. No one else is supposed to be here." I scanned the area for any sign of people. "I'll get our stuff," I said. "You stay in the car." I grabbed the ice chest and tossed it into the back seat. As I turned to get the tent, I heard the footsteps again. My stomach dropped. I yanked the tent out of the ground, wrapped it in its tarp, and threw it over my shoulder like a panicked Santa Claus. I shoved it into the trunk, not saying a word as I climbed into the driver's seat. "Do we have everything?" I asked. She nodded. I slammed it into reverse and sped out of the campsite. At the fork in the road, we were lost. There were 6 different paths. "Do you remember which way we came?" I asked her. She didn't know. We took a random path and ended up in another camping spot. I swore under my breath and backed up, trying to find the right way. From where we were, I spotted a small sign behind an overgrown bush. It marked the main path back to the entrance. As we sped away, I saw a faint green light in the woods near where our spot had been. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, had been watching us. We drove 5 hours straight back home. We crashed on my girlfriend's parents' couch around 4 a.m. We never spoke about the trip again. And since then, I've never had the urge to go camping. The memory lingers, a reminder of how quickly a perfect trip can turn into a nightmare.